Good evening, everybody, and good afternoon for those of us in other parts of the world. Thank you very much for joining us. If you are here in the UK, it's incredibly hot. Some of you maybe, if you're up north, have thunderstorms, so I hope your Wi-Fi holds out. But it's a real pleasure to be here for a thinking that I've been looking forward to, I must say. I've just had a few weeks off. And this, I think, will be a highlight. We're joined this evening by a lineup of really interesting and impressive women to talk about a question that has been asked time and again and speculated about rather a lot since the pandemic hit, when an interesting trend sort of seemed to emerge that there seemed to be a pattern of countries that had female leaders or female heads of state coping rather better in terms of infection rates and mortality rates with the virus. And what was interesting for us at Tortoise, for me personally and for us more generally, was that there's been a sort of flurry of quite thin media coverage about that seeming trend. And not many, if any, media outlets seem to go much deeper, to drill into it, to ask why, to see whether the headline statistics stood up to scrutiny, whether the data could be justified. And tonight, what we're going to try and do is do a little bit of that. Does the headline data stack up? And if it does, what don't we know yet? And what conclusions might we draw about the nature of female leadership, female-led countries, and governments that have a better gender parity? So there's a lot in there this evening. I can see already quite a lot of lovely familiar names in the list of participants. So welcome back to anybody who's done one or several of these before. If it's your first thinking, and I know we do have quite a lot of first timers today, the idea of a thinking, as well as hearing from our experts, is that we get to hear from you as well on this. And there are a couple of ways to do that. My colleague, Claudia Williams, is moderating the chat function, so you can find the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like, there she is, hi Claudia. And if you'd like to make a point, share a story, share a perspective, there's no right or wrong. We really just want to hear your reflections about this particular question of whether women make better leaders than men, particularly in times of crisis, I think. You can put your little blue digital hand up and I'll try and come to as many of you as I can. And I think that is probably it. Just to be aware, we are recording this evening's thinking like we always do, so we can take the best bits and share them on social media. And if people miss it, they can watch the whole thing back in the Tortoise app if they want to. So I'm going to start perhaps by trying to hear a couple of your stories, if people feel brave enough to get the ball rolling for us before we come to our expert contributors. If you think about your own personal experience, I'm not asking you to give a definitive answer, I just want you to tell from your own personal experience in times of crisis. Put up your little digital blue hand if you feel that on balance, you would rather have a woman be a leader for you in a time of crisis than a man. Who would rather be led by a woman than a man in a time of crisis? Let's just have a little scan down here. I can see some blue hands, lots of blue hands. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of the blue hands list. There are some people that are hedging their bets a little bit. I wonder if I might come to somebody to share why. How's about, who feels, leave your hand up if you're comfortable for me to come to you. I don't want to jump on anybody if they don't want to talk on screen. I give people a chance to sort of hide away. Let's go to Jill Ruddock, because just so happens you're at the top of my list of hands. Jill, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Why is it that you would rather, in your experience, be led by a woman than a man when they're kind of, everything goes a bit pear-shaped?
Well, I think that women do tend to be more collaborative in their approach, and I think that they do tend, and obviously these are generalizations, so clearly not everybody is like that, but they do tend to focus on the issue and look at solutions and be inclusive in trying to find those solutions, rather than always think about, well, how am I going to look when, when this pans out? So I mean, that's what I would say in brief anyway.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've got a sense of, I absolutely agree that I'm wary of generalizations, and as a card-carrying feminist, I need to be aware of my own confirmation bias when I try and tackle this question. So absolutely, the caveat is well made, but this sense of collaboration and idea of focusing on the answer rather than my appearance and my PR treatment of the answer is something that I think we can come back to. I'm going to start then. We're joined this evening by Professor Uma Kambampati, who has produced, and you've co-authored, I think, a study. You're a Professor of Development Economics and the head of the School of Politics, Economics and International Relations, is that right, at the university?
That's right.
And you have produced one of the only, certainly the only one that I could find, piece of proper academic research that has looked into this data about the first wave of pandemic infection rates and mortality rates, the kind of headline statistics, and try to correlate that with countries that are male-led versus female-led, and you had some really interesting findings. Would you mind just sort of explaining what you discovered when you dug into the data a little bit deeper?
Yeah. Okay, so we started off with what you said earlier, which is the sets of memes that came out with 7 female leaders, all of whom media was telling us were doing very well. And we thought, what would happen if we... we went to the data, and there are about 19 countries out of 194 that are currently female-led. 19 countries is too small to do the usual kind of statistical techniques on them. We looked at the raw data, and the raw data was pretty staggering, actually, because the raw data showed in the first quarter, and this was the 19th of May, that the last bit of data that we looked at, COVID cases in female-led countries were about 19,000, and in male-led countries, 24,000 on average.
Okay.
And COVID deaths were 1,100 in female-led countries and 2,021 in male-led countries. So this was already, as just averages, was quite staggering. We then thought, well, yeah, okay, but female-led countries might be smaller. I mean, all of these reasons that we are being told. So we thought what we really need to do is to be systematic about this. And the way we latched onto was to try and match each female-led country, because we only had 19, so it was easy enough to match each female-led country with a male-led country with similar characteristics. Of course, we could vary the characteristics. So to start with, we used 4 characteristics that we know from discussions are important in the transmission of COVID. So we matched it by population, small versus large. We matched by GDP. We matched by urban populations, so urban agglomerations, and we matched by the proportion of population over 65.
Okay.
And it's pretty obvious. I can explain later why we might have chosen these. We then looked at the nearest neighbor. So each female-led country with the nearest neighbor, the nearest 2, the nearest 3, and the nearest 5 neighbors, which were led by men. And consistently, it came out that female-led countries had lower cases, but much more significantly, they had much lower death rates.
Right.
We then extended our matching criteria to 3 other variables. We looked at health expenditure, which was really important. As you can imagine, this is a health pandemic. Tourism traffic, because if a country is reasonably isolated, you might expect it to be less affected. And the third was gender inequality. So the idea being that there might be certain countries that elect women as leaders, but the fact that they've elected women as leaders implies that they have certain characteristics and certain types of institutions which make them better. But we matched by this as well. And having matched, the results don't change. It's extremely robust results up until, of course, the first quarter. So the caveat that we have to place here is that we're talking about the first quarter, which means the initial response of leaders, women and men,
Yeah.
rather than, you know, a thought out response by which institutions might come into play. We looked at why that might be, and really the main thing we looked at was lockdown. And it was clear from our results that women locked down earlier.
Right.
What did we mean by earlier? It was approximately 25 deaths. Women locked down earlier in terms of the number of deaths than men did, male leaders did.
Okay.
And that again is a pretty consistent result, matching whichever along all of these criteria. So overall, you know, our results stacked up. We did conjecture, you know, we had started off by thinking it might be because female leaders are more risk averse as far as lives are concerned.
Yeah.
It could be, so we conjecture, we have not tied down the reasons. It could be that that's the reason. But of course, it's not and overall female leaders are risk averse because it's clear that they took risks with the economy, right?
Yeah.
So they were willing to be to take risks with the economy, but not with lives. So there's a domain issue here about what female leaders versus male leaders are willing to take risks with. And then I think the main, I'll stop and people can ask questions, but I think the main final thing that is worth stating is that challenges come in many shapes and forms. You know, challenges are diverse. We need diverse leadership. 19 out of 194 is not diverse leadership.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize that what this paper is not saying is that in every situation, a female leader will be better than a male leader. We haven't tied down the reasons.
Yeah.
But what we are saying is that there are certain types of challenges where it looks as if women leaders are better at dealing with issues than male leaders.
Thanks ever so much. I mean, I think it's completely fascinating that when you try and control for as many variables as is feasibly possible to get to something approaching a like-for-like comparison, that the findings are so robust and so consistent. And I take your point, it's well made. And I'm going to come in a second to President Halonen, who was president of Finland for 12 years, so really knows how it feels to be the woman in charge and making the decisions. I'd love to know, because the research, as the professor says, doesn't go into detail about explaining why that might be. But I wonder if, President Halonen, from your experience, and Finland is a very particular country that has an incredibly strong track record of gender parity, largely, I guess, to the work that you did when you were president for 12 years. Why do you think it might be that we see this strong trend in these types of countries?
So thank you making the questions. Firstly, I want to say that even Finland, my home country, was the first one to give the full political rights for the women already more than 100 years ago. Still, this subject seems to be a bit sensitive. When we have also got the reflections about the COVID-19 situation in Finland, and we have discussed about the possibility, what has been in media internationally, that is it different when women are leaders. So the echoes by many male experts have been quite emotional, not positive, but emotional. So I noticed that I have been very careful giving my opinions if I don't want to make a political storm in the teacup. But anyway, so I think that this discussion is very important, not only because if these leaders, as being a woman, if they have a different kind of experience, and if this has an effect, because of course, mainly also in Finland, the girls' education is more dominated by such kind of social abilities like which are connected to health and social welfare, culture, and communication, and so on. Another thing is that whether this is more that this kind of phenomenon is more common in the society, that it reflects only this from the society to the leaders. And then the third point is, of course, that always we remind that the number of the women leaders is so small that as a president of the Helsinki University, I wouldn't dare to say too strongly that how the situation is this or that, but what I really want to say is that this is worth of studying and researching. I'm very thankful for the research which has been already started, and I hope so that we go on. So it's more intuition when I say also, based also on these facts we heard, that it seemed to be so that in the modern society, security in the modern version, security is much more many-sided. It's a much broader variety of what it used to be in the past, where it was mainly all researchers and politicians were based on the idea that it's the security is based in arms, that it's an armed conflict. And now we know already very well, even before the COVID-19, that the all kind of the risks for the modern society and its members is much broader, and we can collapse the whole society without touching the arms. And in that way, I think that, so bad to say, of course, that COVID-19 has been a very realistic training now for us that what to do. And I hope so that we can carry more positively in there. But really, I do think so that the education, the experiences what most of the women have is fitting perhaps a little bit better in the modern society than what was the tradition as male. That's all.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much for being here, because I know it's late already in Finland, so thank you for holding on and doing a long day for us. We appreciate it. I'm going to come to our third expert speaker. There's some brilliant contributions in the chat, and we have got some of the data from Professor Kamanpatti's research that I think is interesting to show graphically, which my colleague Giles will sort of talk through so we can see the numbers for ourselves. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce Madam Adrienne Clarkson, who was the 26th Governor General of Canada and has had a long and illustrious career in a number of roles. You're a best-selling writer and a broadcaster and done all kinds of interesting work, particularly around citizenship in Canada, and have occupied positions of influence and what might be called, I suppose, soft power, and influenced and changed culture in the way, in a different way than being a sort of democratically elected president would. And I'd like to ask you, Madam Clarkson, if I can, about the second of the sort of hypotheses that came out of the research to try and begin to explain why it might be that in this early wave of the pandemic, female-led countries have fared a little better, which was to do with the nature of female communication and women perhaps being more inclined to communicate in a detailed and empathetic way rather than just a directive way. I don't know if that's something that you have reflections on from your many different roles that you've held, where you've influenced. You've worked a lot with the military, you've had all kinds of different environments. What do you think there's anything in the generalization that women and men have different styles of communication?
Of course, men and women are completely different. And I think if the human race didn't have to continue, they probably wouldn't get together at all. It's very comfortable to be with other women. We understand each other. We have, we were actually put on earth, it created to be men and women to be very different and to have different roles. And I think women share a kind of bond because their physical selves, they're reminded of what they can do every single month. Every single month from the time they are about 11 or 12, women know that the future of the human race is in them. And I think that's something that they never get over. It doesn't matter how well educated you are, how many opportunities you have, you do have this knowledge of yourself as a woman. And I think women understand that about each other as well. All to say that as a second wave feminist of the 70s, I am pretty hardline in terms of my feeling about the patriarchy and what it has done and how it reacts And the patriarchy will slap back immediately because men cannot get over the fact that women actually control life. And that's why you see all the things you see about how women should not be in control of their own bodies, how women are seductive, use their ways and to manipulate men, etc. It's a position of weakness from which men speak, and they understand that. And with the second wave of feminism, we had a lot of writing and research about what we were like as women. And I think those of us who started our lives then publicly, like President Hallinan and myself, we really knew what we were up against because there were very visible barriers. Not so much perhaps in Finland and the other Scandinavian countries, but in a country like Canada, which is, you know, a British Commonwealth country, men really take the lead. And we have two roots. We have Francophone and Anglophone, and the Francophone roots also, men take the lead. So it was something to grow up in that and to realize that if you were going to make your way, you would have to be nourished by women who had managed to get a foothold somewhere, and that you yourself would bring along other women as you could. I think that has been a very, very important thing. During the COVID crisis, it's been very interesting. We have 10 provinces in Canada and 2 territories. And of those, the chief medical officer in each of those provinces is a woman. And our chief medical officer of Canada is a woman. And a number of them also, not only are women, but are immigrants. I myself am an immigrant. I was a refugee, came to Canada when I was 3 years old. What's interesting about seeing people on television talking about COVID and the number of doctors that we have talking about, the immunologists, the people who are specialists, is to see the diversity of our population. So that not only do we have a lot of women doctors, but we have women doctors who have names like the professor's name. We have women doctors who are every kind of background. I think in terms of leadership, what women bring to their leadership is a sense that life, because they've carried it, they can carry it, or potential carriers of it, whether they're mothers or not. They know that that's something that they have, that they are very careful about life. And I think when you see a situation where New Zealand, for instance, has had the most successful lockdown, they've had reverberations again. But what we are looking at is a crisis in the world that has nothing to do with an economic crisis initially. You see, all the crises that we talk about are the Great Depression or 2008 or whatever. And all of these are things that are controlled through our marketplace, what we do as human beings. This is something that's come to us through nature. And in nature, I think women deal with nature and think about nature in a way that is very different from men. And I think that is just something that is in the back of their minds. And I think men who have a great deal of the feminine within them, and here we enter the territory of Carl Jung, also can reach that in themselves. But there's no question that the world has been fundamentally created by men, for men, and continues to be. And so women have to make their place for it. I've been very impressed with how our medical officers in Canada have behaved. I think that we have had good leadership from our men. I'm not saying that. We have had excellent leadership, and our government has been very good in handling the crisis. But I think that women really need to know that they can handle deep crises always themselves, and that not everything is about economics.
Thank you very much, Madam Clarkson. An impassioned thesis, and I could see some smiling, nodding faces from some of the women on the call. I'm going to come now to my colleague, Giles, who has put together some slides, some of which is taking the data from the Hi Giles Professor's study. Alfie, if you could share the slide so that we can have a look at the data, and Giles is just going to talk us through what we have discovered. Well, what actually the Professor has discovered and what Giles has packaged.
Yes, packaged probably clumsily. Thanks, Liz. I'm very conscious with all this data that the professor knows a great deal more about it than any of us could, and than I certainly do. So please feel free to jump in, tell me where I'm wrong or where any conclusions are tendentious. But these are the 9 female-led countries most discussed in this debate, and we've tried to arrange them in order of wealth in terms of GDP per capita. This particular slide really shows that against world averages in terms of cases of COVID per million and deaths per million, with 2 startling exceptions, Taiwan and New Zealand, actually female-led countries don't stand out. Now that is because, as I understand it, there are a lot of countries in the world, 192 of them, most of them are small and most of them haven't had much COVID. And the average cases per million and deaths per million for these 9 countries are 2,575 and are 2,198 and 52 respectively. So they're actually quite close to the world average. So if we can go to slide 2, then the contrast that we've been discussing comes into greater focus. Now, apologies in advance. The bottom graphic is a straight lift from Professor Kambhampati's paper published this year. The top graphic is a cheekier one, less responsible. As I've tried to explain, it takes averages from the slide you've just seen and compares that with corresponding averages from the 9 countries with the highest COVID caseload as of yesterday, all those countries being big and having a great deal of COVID. Now, I accept that this is not strictly comparing apples with apples. We're basically comparing the 9 richest female-led countries with the 9 countries worst hit by COVID, which all happen to be male-led. And this is not something that any responsible statistician would get away with, but nonetheless, the contrast is marked. The contrast is also evident in the more responsible statistics that Professor Kambhampati has used in her paper, which shows the very small sample number, 19, of female-led countries in the world as a whole. Let that grow. Let's move on swiftly to the 3rd slide, Alfie, if we can. Again, a straight lift from the professor's paper. What this doesn't show is the blue bar. We've only been able to take one of the many examples that this excellent paper, and I commend it to you, uses. But this is an example of 2 comparable countries, similar populations, and the effect of locking down early. What it doesn't show is the corresponding graphs for cases at lockdown as distinct from deaths at lockdown. And that's perhaps a more interesting trigger, but it does show trigger for action on the part of leadership. But it does show a very marked difference in deaths as a result of moving early, as between New Zealand and Ireland, Germany and the UK, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Let's just move on to the 4th slide if we can. So the question here is, what other factors, apart from gender of leader, and this is a very crude effort to illustrate this, might have had a bearing on COVID cases and deaths? It's something the professor's already talked about. You might expect that GDP per capita would have a bearing, and 7 out of these 9 countries have a markedly higher GDP per capita than average. You might expect that healthcare spending per capita would have a bearing, and again, 7 out of 9 markedly higher than average and way up there with the US, even though of course they've had a disastrous outcome in so many respects. And you might expect that low population density might have a bearing. And on the whole, with 2 exceptions, these countries have relatively low population densities. I think the exceptions here, and I don't know the answers to the questions they pose, but I think the exceptions are fascinating. Taiwan on the one hand and Bangladesh on the other. I'm sure that the case of Bangladesh is worthy of a whole another thinking itself, because I'm sure there are many factors that can account for the difference in fortune with COVID as between Bangladesh and Pakistan and other countries, but its success is marked. And the final slide is not actually to do with data at all. It's the words speak for themselves. The middle quote is from the professor. It points to the theme of willingness to take risks on the part of female leaders with the economy, but not with lives. And all the thumb portraits of some of our participants are obscuring the final quote on my screen, but I do think it's worth reading on the day after Kamala Harris was chosen as, or accepted the role of being Joe Biden's running mate. So let's indeed elect more female leadership.
Thank you very much, Giles, and well done for being the man bravely entering the fray on this one. And I think it is helpful to see some of the statistics, and it's definitely prompted some additional thought about what would be useful for us to know in terms of data, further data, to sort of really make sure that we're not drawing convenient conclusions or conclusions that aren't going to really help us improve the representation of women in politics and other positions of leadership. I'm going to come and bring in some people that have made particularly interesting comments in the chat, and I'm smiling to myself that Aviva Wittenberg-Cox, who by coincidence was somebody, she runs Aviva 21st, a gender consultancy, and I think maybe even Canadian, I'm not sure about that, is on by coincidence, and we've picked your words on the slide, so thank you very much for that, Aviva. I'm going to come to, I am Canadian, there you go. I'm going to come to, if I can, Catherine Deschamps, who I have been on a thinking with before, who made a comment that I think picked up on an important element of President Hallinan comments about education. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Liz. Happy to be with you again today.
To see you as well. Are you in the States? Are you in Boston?
Yeah, I'm still in Houston. Yeah, in lockdown.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about what you were saying to do with education and culture and expectations and things.
Yeah, so I was just saying I agreed with Tario's point around it all stemming from the choice of subjects we choose in our education, determining a sort of one path, if you like. Not that that's exclusively the case, but I think you have women who primarily take the arts and languages, heavy subjects, whereas you typically find the men taking the STEM related subjects. And I think that reflects on how we see things. So on the arts and language, you have philosophy and you have sociology, and that, I think, if I look back at my days at university, and I studied arts and languages, and so I think that had a real impact on how I viewed life and my EQ side, and I think that ultimately reflects in how we have leaders today, having a big impact. And it's cultural. You have New Zealand, and you're hearing about New Zealand and Jacinta Ardern, and I think someone commented about at all levels in New Zealand, they have female leadership, and not just at the top in government. And I think that says a lot, and then that creates a culture in itself. So
thanks ever so much, Catherine. I agree. And I think to sort of widen out this question of female leadership, the data in the study is about female-led, so the sort of head of state. But there are obviously a lot of other very important female voices and roles to be played, and particularly in a crisis like this, there's this feeling, I feel very strongly as a British citizen, that I can quite often read into the fact that in the decisions that are coming out of the government, I just kind of know there's not been a woman in that room. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the situations we're having with women being expected to go back to work when the schools haven't opened yet, and all of this stuff, women's jobs have been disproportionately more affected. You just kind of know that there's not been that sort of frame. And perhaps it would be worth just sort of expanding our focus a little bit, because I'd be interested in work for us at Tortoise to do to look at the other types of gender balance. You know, there's widely available data about gender parity in, for example, the cabinet, but perhaps less so about the gender balance of the scientific advisory boards, for example, that have been helping governments navigate their way through a big public health crisis. Perhaps several people have made comments about this. Perhaps we try Sally Young up there in Newcastle, who made a comment on this. Hi, Sally, nice to see you.
Hello.
Hello.
I mean, there's so many issues in my head sort of going around with them all. I think there's a number of things. I think there's certainly the issue about communication and dealing with complexity. And if people are leaders, and that could be political or in their everyday lives, if you're a woman, what you can't see here is I'm 5 foot. And I come from the northeast of England, which is traditionally very male dominated. So if you're going to lead, you have to do it differently. There's no point standing and shouting, which I have seen happen in many political situations. You've got to learn to do it differently. And not every woman has had children. I get that. And there are many men who are very active fathers. But if you have had children and you've had to learn to negotiate and consult and engage, you learn to do things differently, because you can't just shout at children and expect them to do things. And equally, if you're a carer. So I think there's a combination of that, and I would like to see it shifting as well. But sometimes you actually have to bring in mechanisms, and one of the comments I made was actually about the quota system, which we have in the UK in the Labour Party, to actually get more women to be elected representatives. So sometimes you have to do things in order to right a wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks ever so much, Sally. I'd really like to comment, I don't know if we can find you, Amy, because you're just called Amy, you don't have a surname, that you made about, there's a sort of, hi Amy, nice to see you. Did you call yourself a cynical feminist?
Kind of, yeah.
Come on then, I love a cynical feminist.
More in the sense, so I've just submitted my master's thesis, and I kind of
congratulations
topic, so I should preempt that I've had a little bit of wine, so that's fine. But yeah, it was more the sense that like society hasn't really let women be like leaders as well. So like when you compare like Jacinda Ardern to Trump, that generally that just isn't a good comparison anyway, because they're two completely different people. But yeah, that was kind of what.
I suppose it talks a little bit to that point that we've touched on, although perhaps we can unpack it a bit more, which is what are the conditions, what are the steps that are created that wind up a country with a leader like Jacinda versus a leader like Donald Trump. There's a series of non-sequential and complex forces that create that outcome that, you know, it's not a sort of one and done type situation, otherwise it would all be desperately easy, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've noticed from the kind of like the nature of the crisis at the moment has been that it's required like community and everyone in the nation to kind of come together and pull together as a group, which is kind of ties in with this like stereotypical like female traits, whether you like agree with that women naturally have that or not.
Yeah,
which kind of feeds into that women can like succeed in this situation. But I'd want to see like women succeed in, like, as someone mentioned before, like a economic crisis that's kind of typically masculine, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. I think that it would be interesting as well for us to think about as we learn more about how this whole thing is going to pan out, because as the professor says, we're still at the beginning, really. Yeah. Unfortunately, although it does feel like a long time in lockdown. It would be interesting to look at what had happened before in the countries that had tended to do better, or that go on to do better in terms of recovery and long-term resilience to this virus, in terms of investment in flexible care options, different types of jobs, the way that, you know, even clean air and things like that have all got factors on how populations respond to the virus. I think that is something that is worth us keeping an eye on, so that we can not just look at, well, it's boys and girls. I know I'm being reductive to make a point, but also that means in terms of the nature of the priorities and where the money is invested. I mean, I worry a lot about the focus of the recovery in the UK being building. I worry that that's not quite going to do the job. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think as soon as I heard Boris say like build, that kind of put me in like that's not the solution to this. Like, you have so many females that, like, it's not that women aren't like prepared to go into building jobs, it's just we're not socialized to go into them. Yeah, because I should say that my like master's thesis was kind of in this kind of area of like looking at anger within women's leadership, so it kind of feeds in nicely. That's why I'm here, slightly tipsy, but I'm here.
Great. I mean, brilliant. What a feeling when you get that thing handed in. That's amazing. So all the very best. I'm sure it's amazing, but good luck with it. I'm going to come to a few more people who are, I almost can't keep up with the chat because there's a lot of interesting stuff being raised. I'm going to go to a man, because we're all about diversity here at Tortoise. So Mike Duckett, you're there with some numbers that would be interesting for you to share. Are you there, Mike? Hiya.
Hi. Yeah, I'm always interested in what's the reality behind male-female stereotypes. As an undergraduate psychologist, I got quite interested in those sort of issues. That's a long time ago, and a long time ago in the 70s, whenever I came across studies that were done of female abilities, skills, attitudes, the real numbers were very different to the stereotypes. And there always seemed to be very little difference. I mean, somebody mentioned Margaret Thatcher. I voted Margaret Thatcher in, and I was pleased when she left, because she was not somebody who in the end was particularly collaborative. It's a stereotype. Whilst you were talking, I just wanted to get a sense of what's the reality behind the numbers. And I was a bit surprised that here in the UK, science subjects generally, now of course engineering seems to be different. I've got two female friends who are engineers, but 135,000 engineers male, 30,000 female. So that follows the stereotype. And similarly with maths. But the rest of the subjects that are placed here, there isn't a big difference.
Yeah. I think that the data is certainly slippery, I think, isn't it? And actually, even though there's been a great push recently in all areas of particularly gender equality to get better quality data, and the same now with racial inequality as well, so you can track and measure and benchmark and see the progress. I think the data as is created, as we saw with the gender pay gap reporting, it's only as good as the environment into which it is received, and there are always ways to explain away, or you get the whataboutery. So I think working hard to find reliable and robust and consistent data is certainly something that we ought to, as a data-based analytical newsroom, need to make sure we focus on. I wonder if I might come to perhaps Susie Kershaw, who's been active in the chat in various ways throughout. You've just made a remark about female participation. Susie, are you there? Are you comfortable to come on and talk to us a little bit?
I was swimming just before I came. So, excuse me.
I have also been for a swim today. It was wonderful, so please don't apologise.
I'm here. The thought that started for me before this conversation got going is, I'm a linguist, and is it words come first, or does change happen and words drag behind? And I'm wondering whether the whole point about the word of leadership is a patriarchal concept, and that the concepts that have been being expressed by our wonderful ladies here today are about different ways of being an important part, an engaging or a facilitative person within these communal groups that are now becoming community-based and populace-based, and where is it actually leadership that we're talking about, or is it that there's several different qualities of role where a community needs to root itself in different concepts.
Yeah.
If we change the vocabulary, we take some of the toxicity and the invisible associations we have. I mean, somebody talked about, it isn't, we don't talk about weapons. We're talking about a range of, what did somebody say? A more, risks are broader now. It's not just who's got the biggest guns or physical presence, dare I say it, in polite terms.
Yeah.
And so it's not boys' games in that way.
Yeah.
And so therefore we're using the vocabulary that comes out of that confrontational armed struggle or conflict.
Yeah, interesting. I think the language point, I'm also in another world, I've studied sociocultural linguistics, so the language point really chimes with me. I might come back if I can, as we get into the last sort of 10 minutes or so, to our invited guests, perhaps to President Hallinan. It's evident that we would be foolish to draw conclusions, which was rather like you were saying at the beginning. It's foolish and perhaps unhelpful with the data that we have available to us at the time. And if we take it as read that we're all here because we believe that a better way to lead or govern is a more diverse way, that the two things go together, I think we can accept that there's a consensus on that. I'm interested to know, from your experience, both as president and since then, in all the various roles of influence that you have now, whether you have ever sort of consciously wanted to surround yourself with more women in order to sort of change the dynamic of the conversation, and if so, how did you go about doing that?
So thank you. So I think that first, of course, all kind of the public visible examples are very important because they encourage both girls and boys, but especially girls if they have been underrepresented. And I think that it's very important to say that these are always processes, that what happens, like a still photo is not, it's of course interesting, but important is a process. And I think that behind these statistics, what we have now seen, there has been already process. It's not just now, but it has been part of the process. But what I would like to tell to everybody, and especially for men and also the mothers and fathers of the sons, it doesn't tell that this is forever. I think that why we are also telling that now the girls and the women have done quite a change in their profile. But what we are now looking for is that what is the role of the modern man, what is the role of the boy and the man of the future. Because I think that these are not based on our gender as such, but only at this historical stage. And that's why I do hope so that all the boys and girls in the future could get not only in the official education, but also at home and with all the fellow citizens, such kind of care and treat that they can become what they really are. And so we got this diverse system and talents what we needed sustainable development and in the future world. And that's something what United Nations have underlined very strongly in sustainable development goals, that we never will reach it if we don't also see all these resources of the world's population. Now, of course, at this historical moment, it means also that especially those millions and millions of girls and boys, girls and women, that they could show all their talents and they could get an opportunity. But one thing what we have not time to discuss here too much, but it has been already touched, is that economics versus other parts of the well-being. I think that, for instance, those countries what we have seen and what has been so-called positive here, also positively managed in this COVID-19, they have put very carefully the health and perhaps sometimes a little bit broader also the well-being, what's the next target. And of course they know that in the later stages it can be so that for instance we have a more difficult consequences, reflections in economics. And some countries, they have taught first and foremost the economics. And this is not only just the money, it's of course employment, and it's all kind of the structure of the society. And that's why I think it's very interesting to compare whether in all these groups, what we consider to be, for instance, the traditional welfare states, whether they have differences, how they have taken this COVID and how to do. And what I have learned, that so-called herd immunity was one of those strategies what we were offered in the beginning. And some of the Nordic countries, Sweden has taken that one. But it has been a very, very difficult to show that it could be a good system. I think that with vaccination we try to do that, but could we do it beforehand? And so we need also a lot of more know-how from the medicine, from this side, that what the COVID-19 is, and it's not the only one. It's not the only part we have to do and to know in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. There's a lot in there, and I'm too tempted by the presence of Aviva Wittenberg-Cox in the chat to not go and hear a little bit from her, if she's okay to come on screen. Aviva, are you there? Maybe she's not got a camera on. Aviva, I'd love to hear from you in person. Hi, lovely to see you. Oh, can we hear you? Oh, I don't know if we can. No, we can't hear you. We've got no sound. Oh, how disappointing. I was going to ask about your comment about the 20th century was the rise of women, and the 21st century is about the adaptation of countries, companies and men to sort of meet that rise. I think it's fascinating. I don't know if our tech team can do some magic and manage to be able to hear you, but if not, for another time. I don't think we can hear Aviva, unfortunately, but at least we got to see your lovely face. Never mind, we're foiled. The patriarchy is at work in the background to prevent you from being heard. I do apologise. Let's have perhaps a closing remark, if we can, from Madame Clarkson, and then we'll go back to where we started with the professor, just as we enter the last couple. Just 60 seconds, Madame Clarkson, if you can bear it on, just to say, do you feel optimistic, having seen all that you have seen and lived the life that you have lived, for the future of, let's say, world leadership as regards female and male styles of leadership? Are you optimistic that we're on the right path or not?
Yes, I'm very optimistic that we are on the right path, because I'm 81 years old now, and I've seen an enormous amount in my life. And I believe that we have come out in a way which is fantastic. Never forget, there are a number of things. There was a wonderful book written at the high point of the 70s called The Mermaid and the Minotaur by Dorothy Dinnerstein, in which she said that women were going to find it very difficult to be leaders, because men, when their mark of growing up is to no longer listen to the voice of their mother. And so if it's the voice of the mother that's the leader, they will reject it. It was a fascinating book, actually, and I think people should reread that in terms of what is the voice of women? How do women present in terms of how they lead and what they lead, what they want to lead? Are they going to be, as Mrs. Thatcher was, a man in a flouncy blouse? She really was not, I think, what one would call a woman in wanting to be part of other women, and yet she had a successful marriage. She had children, all of that. It looked like she was a woman, but in fact she was not a woman, because she really did not behave in a way which is the way that women have to behave with each other in this particular time, which is going to go on for some time now, where they have to support each other. Now, we have had support. In Canada, we had a prime minister who appointed half his cabinet as women in 2015. And when they said, why did you do that? He said, because it's 2015, which was a very nice answer. It was facile, but it was fine. And he's continued to keep that up. And I think it's very important for men to understand that when they become fathers, that they spend time in their homes. I mean, I just read a recent survey that said the average time fathers spend with their children in North America is 20 minutes a day. That's not enough for people to understand what the role of the other sex is, or what they do, or how they're doing it, or whether it's meaningful. And I think that's all kinds of relationships have to change because of that. And also, I think women have to be able to go ahead, proceed, do what they have to do, and not do it with anger. The anger in women is very palpable at times, and it doesn't help. I mean, for women, I am goal oriented. I want them to have positions of power. I want them to be able to change things. I want them to be able to use what we have as people, as women, for the betterment of a human race. Anger does not help. If you're completely blinded by anger and it's underlying every one of your motives, your relationship with men, with sons, with people at work, it's not going to work. That's something that I think we have to really deal with.
Thank you very much, Madam Clarkson, and obviously thank you so much for you're getting a thumbs up from Lynn. I can see just at the top of my screen for your point about anger. I'm going to come back for closing remark just for a minute or so, if we can, to the Professor, if we can. Just we started with you. If you're still there, it'd be lovely. Hello, you are still there, fabulous. I would love to know, because as we said at the beginning, your study is rare. We both expressed surprise that nobody else had done a similar thing. But because we're early in the pandemic still, it's not a fulsome study. It's a sort of beginnings of some conclusions and some interesting directions of travel. So it's a two-part question. Firstly, will you extend it? Will you pick it up and do it again? And how might that be, and what will you focus on? And secondly, if there was one thread that you would say is worthy of journalistic investigation to accompany your academic investigation, what are the questions that you would be asking if you were us?
Okay, so I think we are intending to extend it, and I think the important issue remains what happens to the economy. Of course, updating the data and seeing what happens in the second quarter and the third quarter is going to be important, but actually seeing what the outcomes are in economic terms, because the economy, as President Hallinan said, is not just about money, right? It is about survival for lots of people. Is also going to be very important. And is it the case that women and men have had the same outcomes as far as the economy are concerned, or the economic costs are concerned? I think as far as journalists are concerned, a really important, useful thing would be to look at the communication skills of women leaders. So one of the things that we feel is that trust in leaders is really important. There are some leaders that people listen to, and there are others people don't listen to. And why is that the case? So we know in the UK, for instance, some of our problem has been mixed messages from the government, and therefore people not knowing what they want to listen to, and also, not really trusting the government to be giving them the right signals. We know that some of the leaders, and we've got that in the paper, there are a handful of leaders who've actually had very good communication skills with individuals. So people who, Jacinda Ardern has used Facebook Live, for instance. President Solberg has actually spoken to kids. So, it's this kind of thing that inculcates the ability to actually talk to people and explain to them why you're doing certain things. Now, it's that kind of investigation, I think, that would be useful. It is important, I think, at the end of the day, we've talked very much in terms of gender. I think it's useful to step back a little and think of feminine traits and masculine traits. They exist in both genders, really. And there are feminine traits that make for good leadership in certain types of challenges, and there are masculine traits that make for good leadership in other types of challenges. And I'll just leave us with one question. I often think, what would have been the outcome for the UK had Theresa May still been Prime Minister? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought you were going to tell us. No, we know. None of us know.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Thank you very much to all our amazing speakers. I have made some points of specific things that I think are interesting. We'll go away and think about, potentially develop I'm always drawn to the linguistic contributions, and I'm interested in what Imre has just said at the end there about really analysing different leaders' communications. I think we have done a little bit of sort of light touch linguistic analysis in a feature we do in Tortoise called Primary Sources, where we look at, for example, Dominic Cummins' blog and the words that are used in there and how it's structured and things like that. We've done similar things with when Prince Andrew was interviewed by Emily Maitlis. I wonder if sort of key speeches that are given by leading politicians about their plans for recovering from the pandemic might be an interesting sort of mini research project for us to look at the kinds of metaphors that are used, the kinds of focus that is used, the kind of similes and things to paint a picture of how they imagine the recovery to be and the balance of build and care within that. To your point about feminine traits and masculine traits. I loved Aviva's question about it's fascinating to compare female and male economists and the way that they think about the possibilities of the world, the possibilities for an economy. And certainly there was a lot of really excellent chat sort of halfway through about analysing public health and public health staffing and representation and advice as part of a package of solutions in relation to the pandemic, which goes beyond just sort of, you know, gender parity in terms of government representation. So there's a few data points I think we can unpack. There's a really interesting piece on gender, funnily enough, today in the Tortoise app that looks and talks about how gender studies has evolved over the past sort of 40, 50 years and where it might go next in terms of handling helping children to understand gender in their own lives, which talks a little bit to President Hallinnan's points about opportunities. So there's a lot to get at in this topic. I've really, really enjoyed it. I'm so, so grateful to President Hallinan, to Madam Clarkson, and to Professor Kambhampati for their time and for the work that they have done over the course of their lives to represent women, and to everybody who has been, I think this has been the liveliest chat of lockdown. So congratulations to everybody who's participated as well. I've really enjoyed it. Have a lovely evening. I really, really hope it rains soon because I just can't take the humidity any longer. So enjoy the rest of your day, Madam Clarkson. To everybody else, thank you so much. Look after yourselves and each other, and we'll see you all again next week.